Welcome. My name is Rob Miller, and today I have the opportunity to sit down with Steve Watt, Trimble's Market Segment Manager for Cost Estimating Solutions. Steve, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into this, you have an interesting history in estimating. So if you would, tell us kind of how you got into construction.
Sure. So I've been involved with estimating software and estimating software solutions now for a little over 30 years. In 1985, I moved from actually the education industry into high tech. Worked for an estimating software vendor in Portland, Oregon for 20 years. Saw a lot of transition in the industry during that 20-year period of time. Decided to move and migrate to Seattle, Washington, where I became the president and CEO of WinEst Software, and was in that role for a good 8 years before we were acquired by Trimble, which is where I'm at today.
Perfect. So you're joining us today to talk about database-driven estimating. So if you would, start with that. What exactly do we mean by database-driven estimating?
Yeah, so database-driven estimating is a term that we use, or a phrase that we use to talk about having a cost library that really captures a company's estimating methodologies. A database is really important because no two companies estimate projects exactly the same way, meaning same level of detail, same methodology. And a database-driven estimating solution allows a company to capture their specific methodology and actually use that information in the database to drive their spreadsheet, ultimately, that spreadsheet that contains the estimate. And there's lots and lots of advantages to having a database-driven estimating, things like standardization, best practices, those kinds of things. So it's really about a database underlying that spreadsheet or underlying that estimate.
Okay, so we will talk a little bit about that standardization and those best practices. But before we do that, specifically the solution we're talking about is Trimble's WinEst. So tell us a little bit how WinEst came about.
Yeah, so in 1992, so in the early 90s, WinEst was developed primarily by a large mechanical contractor in the Northwest that was looking for a very specific estimating system and couldn't find what they were looking for in the market. So they actually funded that work. And it was developed and released. Version 1 was actually released in 1992. The product has evolved over the years. It was introduced as a Windows-based product. It is still a desktop product today. It is very much an enterprise level product, so people use it in both a single office environment and a multi-office environment. The database is multi-user, so the cost library is meant to be shared across tens, if not hundreds of estimators with all the record locking and all the things that you would expect to have in a database-driven tool. So WinEst had its beginnings in 1992, and today I think it's arguably the leading estimating solution in North America, and continues to evolve. And that's my role, actually, is to make sure that the product continues to evolve, that it does what contractors need today from an estimating perspective, but we obviously have to have an eye to the future so that we make sure that the estimating product and its capabilities does what it needs at the time the contractor needs it.
Perfect. Now, let's talk about standardization and the best practices. Can you give us some examples of what this type of implementation of database-driven estimating would mean to a company?
Sure. I'll start with standardization. Before people would deploy a software solution like WinEst, many of our customers were using products like Excel. And Excel is a highly flexible, very, very powerful spreadsheet. Along with that flexibility, though, comes, in some cases, a lack of standardization. If an organization has 5 or 10 estimators, typically in Excel, what can happen a lot of times, if you've got 5 or 10 people creating their own estimates, creating them from scratch, applying their own look and feel and format to those estimates, to the outside world, 5 estimates created by 5 different estimators in Excel can look like they were created by 5 different organizations. And to the outside world, that can be confusing. The other issue around standardization is just the idea of getting people to kind of work with the same level of detail included in an estimate, just making sure that people adhere to those standards, that things like work breakdown structures and those kinds of things, how an estimate is broken down by a cost coding structure, that people are adhering to a similar methodology, again, so that we look like one organization to the outside world. It's easier to review estimates before signing off on estimates if things are coded the same way. Another area of standardization is in the area of reports. In a lot of cases, in just a generic spreadsheet environment, if I've got 5 different look and feels to estimates that we're creating in Excel, that means the output is going to look different for all 5 of them. So that standardization is really key. Best practices when it comes to database-driven estimating, when I talked earlier about the database capturing estimating methodology, one of the things I always tell organizations is, every contractor has been stung by having a lead estimator or their most knowledgeable estimator, and when I say knowledgeable, the most complete, they don't leave things out of an estimate. And that's a scary day when that estimator comes in and hands in their 2-week notice. Either maybe a competitor lured them away, or they're retiring, and out the door of that company walks a tremendous amount of knowledge. And in a lot of ways, without the database, that knowledge was in that person's head, so that knowledge walked out the door with that person. A database-driven system means you take that lead estimator or that most knowledgeable estimator and capture the thought process in their head, capture it in the database, and you can leverage then that best practice and really raise the bar for the entire estimating team.
Now, when you do this, obviously you're creating a database with a lot of intellectual property of your company and how you do things, but it's got to be easy for your team to get up to speed. And you mentioned it, but WinEst is based around a very familiar spreadsheet type environment to make it easy for those users to get started using this, but adding that power behind it, correct?
That's correct. And, if in the early 90s, when you think about the start of WinEst, a tremendous amount of research was done. You obviously look at how people are putting estimates together at that time. And when we talk to people that were using Excel, we ask some key questions. Obviously, one of the first being, what do you like about Excel? And people would say, well, I like its flexibility. It's easy to understand. It's easy to use. It's a familiar environment. It might even kind of mirror the way that they were putting estimates together with pencil and paper in the old days. So it was an easy step, an easy jump to technology. So they really like that part about Excel, its flexibility, its ability to make last-minute changes and those kinds of things. Well, then we followed that up with, what do you not like about Excel? And there was a common theme, and it was there's no database with it. We tend to create estimates from scratch all the time. So that Excel spreadsheet is a blank piece of paper, but along with that blank piece of paper means that it's hard to adhere to standards. We don't have a database. We might have somebody whose thought process is to make sure they do include everything in the estimate. Maybe someone else is not as complete. And so people were saying, we really don't want to start with a blank sheet of paper all the time. We would like actually to pull in from a database of our methods and bring those things into that easy to use, familiar spreadsheet environment. So that really is the backbone of WinEst. Back then, it's still the backbone of WinEst today.
Okay, now this might seem like such a simple question, but the quantities themselves, where are the quantities coming from?
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, it relates to the need to have that highly flexible spreadsheet environment. What I've seen happen, I mentioned earlier, I've been involved in the business for about 30 years, and one of the things that I've seen happen is the quantity inputs and where they come from have evolved many times over the years. In the old days, for some of the older estimators that might be watching this, in the old days, people would take a roller pen or a roller ball on top of a set of blueprints, and with a scale on that, they would get the quantities by tracing that roller ball over the top of a set of blueprints. Then a digitizer tablet, an electronic tablet was released where you could take your paper plans and lay them on top of the tablet, and you had a electronic stylus, and you could now trace those plans just using the stylus, and that with the magnetic grid in the tablet would also return you the quantities that you were looking for. And then, of course, all of a sudden I have access to drawings in PDF format or in a TIFF format. Now I can actually start grabbing quantities electronically off my laptop or off the computer screen using nothing more than my mouse and access visually to the drawing files themselves. And today, people are still doing that with 2D plan sets, so they're doing that electronic plan takeoff that way. But now, obviously, we've got many projects where we have a building model, a BIM model exists for a project, and now I'm mining quantities from the elements and their properties that are contained electronically in that three-dimensional model that I have access to. So now I've got quantities coming from the electronic plans that I can view on the screen. I have quantities coming from 3D models where I can actually mine those quantities electronically. So that has evolved over the years, but the need for that highly flexible spreadsheet environment is still in very much demand. The idea that you can slice and dice that estimate right up to the minute that bid is due.
And I think you've touched on something that's really critical here, and that is estimating is not going away anytime soon. No. It's going to remain a part of construction. And even with all the advancements in technologies and processes, you need a flexible estimating solution that's going to keep up with the way the industry is evolving. And it's good to hear that WinEst is provided and will continue to provide such a solution for contractors.
Absolutely. We'll never lose sight of a couple kind of key factors. So we will always, it'll always be a backbone to the development of WinEst, and that is when you are doing a quantity takeoff, you always need to confirm those quantities in either the context of the drawing or in the context of the model. So it's very important that an estimator believe in those quantities and get acquainted with a project, at the time that they're doing that takeoff. And then the other piece, as you said, that will always be part of that philosophy is that you need that highly flexible environment to provide options in an estimate to make last-minute changes and really respond to an owner in a way that they're looking for today.
Well, Steve, it has been great having you here. I know we've been trying to get you in here for a while. It's good to get you in. And it's been a very interesting conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Anytime. Glad to help out.
If you'd like to learn more about Trimble WinEst, or you'd like to schedule a demonstration, contact your local BuildingPoint representative. And make sure that you connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of everyone here at BuildingPoint, thanks for watching.